Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are discussing the worst values at their current ADP in your ESPN Redraft leagues. So, we are going over at least 2 picks in the second, third, and fourth round that I think are just poor values at their ADP, and then suggesting players at each position that I think are better values at their ADP that you can just snag later. Please remember to like and subscribe. So, we begin with the second round. Chris Olave is currently being drafted at the wide receiver 9. I'm going to go over why I think this is ridiculous. Then we're going to discuss also Michael Pittman at wide receiver 12, which I definitely understand a little bit more at least than Chris Olave's ADP, but I'm also going to go through a couple reasons why I don't think he's going to repeat his wide receiver 13 finish this season. So Chris Olave is being drafted at wide receiver 9. So he's 6 foot 185 and is 24.1 years old. He's going into his third season. He's coming off a wide receiver 16 finish. So why is he being drafted at wide receiver 9? Beats me. So in his rookie year, he had 13.2 fantasy points per game. That was good for 25th. Then he stepped it up to 14.5, which was good for 19th. What has changed in his situation, at least, to cause him to be 7 spots higher than his previous finish in ADP? He still has Derek Carr, who is one of the worst starting quarterbacks that there is. And even worse, he still has Taysom Hill, who is going to vulture touchdowns randomly at points of the season. So while, yes, he is the wide receiver 1 in his offense, it just makes no sense to me. I mean, when we look at his fantasy points per route run, his 0.43 this past season was good for 27th. His fantasy points per target of 1.68 were good for 59th. His catchable target rate, which isn't his fault, was 71.7%, which was 43rd in the NFL. So once again, poor quarterback play. His 25.2 target share was good for 17th. How is it really going to go up much more than that to get him inside the top 10? And his target rate, his targets per route run, was 18th at 25.6%. That's a wide receiver 2 target rate. Now, it's a safe wide receiver 2 target rate. I doubt he's going to finish anything lower than a wide receiver 2. But then we also look at his dominator rating, 24.1%. That's his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns. Well, his 24.1% dominator rating was 36th in the NFL. So once again, his wide receiver 9 price tag just makes no sense to me. You have to think that he is going to massively improve as a player, and probably his situation too, and I just don't see it. And one more thing, I like each and every one of these players. It is merely that I just think the ADP doesn't make sense. So then we have Michael Pittman, who is going as the wide receiver 12. Okay, so this one does make more sense. He did finish as the wide receiver 13 this past season. He's 6'4", 223, and he is 26.8. Historically, 26 is peak production for wide receivers. Now, he isn't their X, he is their Z, but he's always going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets because the Z is the other receiver besides the X. The X is going to be A.D. Mitchell. So one thing, I do think that A.D. Mitchell is going to command more targets than Alec Pierce did. I think he's a much more talented player. Then you still have Josh Downs. Josh Downs, before his knee injury in the middle of the season, was looking really good. Then he really just didn't get many targets afterwards. Then when we think about his touchdown upside, he has had 6 in one season, but his other years he's had 1, 4, and 4. So while he's a very talented player, he generally isn't a high touchdown scorer. And with Anthony Richardson coming back and Jonathan Taylor being healthy, I think it's very likely that they vulture a majority of the touchdowns. Although I do think he's going to have a decent season overall. When we look at his fantasy points per game, he had 14 in 2021, which was 22nd in the NFL. He had 13.5 in 2022, which was good for 21st. And then he did step it up in a big way to 15.6 this last season, and he was 14th. But that's still not 12th in fantasy points per game. So what's getting better here? When we look at his fantasy points per route run, his 0.45 were good for 20th. His 1.6 fantasy points per target were good for 65th. His dominator rating of 26.8% was 30th in the NFL. That's his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns. His target share of 30.5 admittedly was 4th in the NFL, so his target share at least does show that he is a dominant wide receiver that earns targets at a massive rate, and his 28.1% target rate was good for 8th in the NFL. So his total target share and his target rate do support this ADP. But look at the target quality rating and catchable target rate. And now most of this was Gardner Minshew throwing to him, but his 4.94 target quality rating was good for 50th, and his 75.6 catchable target rate was good for 29th. I like Anthony Richardson a lot, and I especially for this season in fantasy, I really, really like him. He really does need to improve a lot as a passer. He doesn't generally make mistakes in the sense of throwing interceptions or fumbling, but he does need to work a lot on his touch and just his general accuracy. Then when you mix in the fact that I think A.D. Mitchell is going to command more targets than Alec Pierce did this past season, I do think we're going to see just a little bit of a dip in Michael Pittman's production, but I still think that he's a solid wide receiver 2. I just don't think that he's going to be a wide receiver 1. So a couple of wide receivers I would rather have than Chris Olave at wide receiver 9 are Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, I don't have any stats to back this up. Obviously, he's a rookie. I just think, first of all, that he's a much better receiver. He's also the number 1 target in his offense, but the difference between him and Chris Olave, and the biggest thing, is that he's going to be receiving passes from Kyler Murray, whereas Chris Olave is going to be receiving passes from either Derek Carr, Taysom Hill, or Spencer Rattler. So I think the QB upgrade is going to be the biggest difference here. Then when we look at Mike Evans, he finished, first of all, as the wide receiver 7 this past season, and now while I do expect him to take just a little bit of a tumble this season, he's averaged the 10th, 13th, and 10th most fantasy points per game. He's still their number 1 target, and he still has Baker Mayfield throwing to him. They didn't make any significant additions. Jalen McMillan is going to play the Z position for them, but he's not going to command a high target share. Really, I don't understand Chris Olave being drafted over Mike Evans at all. Now, as far as Drake London's concerned, his points per game don't support this, but he's also been in the worst situation imaginable. He's had Arthur Smith there. He's had to deal with either Marcus Mariota, Taylor Heineke, or Desmond Ridder in terms of his quarterbacks. So he received not only a scheme upgrade, the Rams scheme, he's also getting 2 quarterback upgrades. Penix is better than any other quarterback he has ever played with. And then Kirk Cousins is one of the most fantasy-friendly quarterbacks that there is. And so he's still the number 1 option with 2 quarterbacks who, in my opinion, are much better than Chris Olave's quarterback. And I personally just think that he's a better player. And the final wide receiver who is going after Chris Olave in your drafts that I think should be going ahead of him is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So the past 3 seasons, he's had the 15th, 12th, and 21st most fantasy points per game, although he did deal with injuries multiple times this past season, which did hamper his points per game, but he finished 12th in fantasy points per game in 2022 with Tyreek Hill there and finished as the wide receiver 8. He's actually finished as a top 10 wide receiver. So in my opinion, all of these wide receivers are going to finish ahead of Chris Olave, and I would much rather take it their ADP than Chris Olave at the wide receiver 9. So wide receivers I would rather have than Michael Pittman is 3 of those wide receivers. Some of the wide receivers mentioned previously are going before Michael Pittman, so obviously they're going ahead of him, so I'm not going to make an argument for them. So Mike Evans, once again, he's finished as the wide receiver 10, 13, and 10 in fantasy points per game, and he just finished as the wide receiver 7. So while I do expect just a little bit of regression, he has finished 10th in fantasy points per game in 2 of the last 3 seasons, and then 13th in the other season. Drake London, I once again would just rather have him because he's the clear number 1. There is Kyle Pitts, but there's no running quarterback to take away touchdowns now. They have the Rams scheme. And he has Kirk Cousins as his QB1, one of the most fantasy-friendly quarterbacks that there is. Jalen Waddle finished 12th in fantasy points per game in 2022 with Tyreek Hill in Miami and finished as the wide receiver 8. So he's actually finished as a top 10 wide receiver in essentially the exact same situation before, and he was just hurt this past season. And so that's why I personally would rather have each one of these 3 wide receivers over Michael Pittman. So in round 3, we have James Cook going as the RB12, Stephon Diggs going as the wide receiver 14, and Nico Collins going as the wide receiver 15. Once again, I don't have any issue with these players. I just think that the ADP is a little bit overpriced. So James Cook is going off the board as the RB12. Now, he did finish as the RB12 this past season. I personally think he is being drafted at his absolute ceiling. This guy is never, ever going to be a top 10 running back unless half of the league gets hurt. Why? He doesn't have touchdown upside. It's really, really hard to be an elite running back if you are not scoring touchdowns. So he's 5'11", 199, which gives him a 27.8 BMI, well below the 30.0 threshold for being a bell cow. Now, he was the only running back worth anything this past season, so he was used as one. But what did they do? They drafted Ray Davis, a big, big back. His BMI is over 32. He is going to be receiving the goal line touches. So rushing touchdowns, James Cook's going to have to score from probably outside the 10-yard line to really have a chance. Then when we look at his fantasy points per game, he had 6.3 as a rookie, which was 51st. Then he did step it up to 13.7, but that was 19th in points per game. If some of the running backs ahead of him wouldn't have been hurt, he would not have finished as the RB12. He's a very good receiving back, and he's going to give you a very safe floor. But in fantasy football, I like to draft for ceiling because that's how you win. You don't win by starting a bunch of safe players that get you at least 10 points every week. You get wins by getting players that can give you over 20, for instance. So looking at a couple of advanced stats here, his 14.2% juke rate was good for 49th. His 40 evaded tackles were good for 23rd. His 4.2 breakaway run rate was good for 26th. His red zone touches of 38 was good for 22nd. That's going down because not only do they have running back Josh Allen, they now have running back Ray Davis. There are now 2 impediments preventing him from getting rushing touchdowns this season. Then when we look at his yards created, his 849 was good for 19th. His 2.99 yards created per touch was good for 43rd. And his 17.9% dominator rating, which is his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns, is good for 30th. Really, none of the stats here suggest that this guy is likely going to repeat as the RB12, let alone have any potential to really exceed that. So he's being drafted at his ceiling. I personally like to draft players at a value who have a chance to well exceed their ADP, not maybe match it at best. So these are running backs that I personally would rather have than James Cook at RB12. Each one of these running backs has already or does have the potential to finish as a top 10 running back. First, we have Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. His 17.3 fantasy points per game this past season were good for 5th. Now, this is buoyed by his 50-point game, but he does have the ability to get you 50-point games. James Cook does not have the ability to get you a 50-point game, and he's not in as good of an offense as Achane. And now, while Achane is in a timeshare, so is James Cook. The only difference, Achane actually gets goal line work. So he does have a chance at much, much, much more upside. Then we have Josh Jacobs. So in 2 of the past 3 seasons, he's had the 13th and 3rd most fantasy points per game. He goes to the Packers, the best supporting cast and offense he's ever been in. He absolutely has way more upside than James Cook. Then you have Alvin Kamara. He just finished as the RB11, so 1 spot above James Cook, and he averaged 17.9 fantasy points per game, which was good for 3rd in the NFL. Nothing has really changed. He has gotten a little bit older, but he has much, much, much more upside than James Cook and outperformed him this past season. Then we have Rachaad White. He averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game, which was good for 10th, and he finished as the RB4. Way, way, way more upside than James Cook. And now, while I do expect him to be a very big faller, I would still rather have him than James Cook because he, once again, does have touchdown upside. They will use him on the goal line. Then we have Aaron Jones. So he did have an injury-riddled season this past year, but in 2 of the past 3 seasons, he's finished as the RB11 in fantasy points per game. and he goes from one offense to another that's at least just as good, they're likely going to want to rely on him a little bit more with Sam Darnold at the helm. He's one of the better receiving backs in the NFL. And once again, has the upside to finish as a top 10 back, and he's going to get goal line work. He's going to be the preferred back in Minnesota. There is no one nearly as talented as him there, and he will get the goal line work. Then you have Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. So now, I could understand somebody disagreeing with this take. I think he has a lot more upside than he's shown us in his first 2 seasons. I do think he's going to be used more as a featured back this season. This guy is one of the better runners in the NFL. For instance, his 29.0% juke rate was good for second. His 72 avoided tackles was good for third. And his 27.0% dominator rating was good for 12th in the NFL. So he actually gets goal line work. He has way, way, way more upside. And now, while he likely will cede some work to Zach Charbonnet, he has looked a lot better than Zach Charbonnet and is going to be the preferred goal line back in this system. And I do expect the offense to be much more efficient. It's Ryan Grubb's offense, former offensive coordinator of the Washington Huskies. They're going to use condensed formations in terms of their passing attack, which is going to make it more potent and going to make it harder for defenses to stack the box against the run because they're going to be much more efficient. Next, we have Stephon Diggs, who is being drafted as a wide receiver 14. Once again, I think he's a talented receiver. I just think that this ADP is crazy. So he did finish as a wide receiver 9. He is 30.7 years old. He was an elite wide receiver 1 in the first half of the season and completely trailed off in the second half. When we look at his fantasy points per game, he finished with the 9th, 6th, and then 13th most fantasy points per game. He went down from 18.9 to 16.1. So keep in mind, this was while being the absolute number 1 option in the offense. Now, I still think that he's going to receive the most targets in this offense, but I don't think it's going to be by that much, and his overall target share and target rate are both going to go down. When we look at his fantasy points per route run, his 0.47 was good for 18th. His 1.71 fantasy points per target was good for 51st. His target separation of 1.65 was good for 46th. His yards per route run of 2.03 were good for 31st. His route win rate of 48.4 was good for 40th. His 39.0 win rate versus man was good for 36th, while also receiving a 29.5% target share, which was 9th in the NFL. That's going down. And a target rate of 27.4, which is good for 13th. That's going down. So essentially, he is a declining player who is going into a much more crowded situation. So while he's still talented, he's just not going to be consistent enough, in my opinion, to pay off this wide receiver 14 ADP. Now we have Nico Collins, who is going as the wide receiver 15 off the board. He did finish as the wide receiver 12, and his actual stats in terms of his fantasy finish and points per game, as well as a couple of key metrics, do look very good. I do have a couple reasons why I don't think he's going to pay off this wide receiver 15 ADP, though. So when we look at his fantasy points per game, he's gone from 76th to 49th, all the way up to 7th, with 17.4 this past season. Now, a couple of stats to like. His 0.65 fantasy points per route run were good for 4th. His fantasy points per target of 2.39 was good for 3rd. His target share is going down, though. His 22.7% was already 29th in the NFL. It's just that CJ Stroud and him were very efficient with his targets. So that's going down. Then when you look at his target rate of 27.3, that was 14th in the NFL. That's going down. When we look at his target separation, he actually wasn't quite as good at getting open as you might think. His 1.74 yards of target separation was good for 37th, so not terrible by any means, but not elite. Then when you look at his route win rate, his 40.4% was good for 96th. So not that good, actually. Then when his win rate versus man, his 35% was good for 61st. Not that good. Then when we look at his contested catch rate, his 35.7% was good for 62nd. Now, that is a little bit of a fluky stat from year to year, but that's still not very good. So basically, if Stephon Diggs had not gone to Houston, I think that he very easily could pay off this ADP. But with Stephon Diggs there, I don't think either one of them is going to be the wide receiver 14 or 15 this season. So, a couple of wide receivers that I would rather have than Diggs and Collins. I would rather have DK Metcalf this season. So, if you think about Ryan Grubb's offense, think about how Rome Odunze did this past season. That's going to be DK Metcalf in this offense. He is going to be the vertical X wide receiver. They're going to use condensed formations to free him up. He does have positional versatility to be a flanker and a slot if need be. He's going to be the number one target rather easily, in my opinion. I do think JSN is going to overtake Tyler Lockett. I just think the overall offense is going to be much, much, much more efficient. And one thing, we've already seen a top 10 season from DK Metcalf in points per game. So that one is just a little bit of projection, but I do believe in DK Metcalf more than either one of them two this season. Then Cooper Kupp, in 2 of the past 3 seasons, he's been the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy points per game. Now, he does have Puka Nacua to contend with, but they only have 2 wide receivers in this passing offense that are generally going to get a large amount of targets. So Diggs and Collins do have to contend with Tank Dell. So I do think that I like Cooper Kupp a little bit more than either one of them two this season. He does have more upside in my opinion. Then Malik Neighbors, his targets are going to be awful, but he is going to be targeted just about every passing play. It would not shock me if he gets 170 targets this season. Then Brandon Ayuk averaged the 16th most fantasy points per game this past season while finishing as the wide receiver 14. I do think that Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel are going to be targeted and be a little bit more consistent players than Collins and Diggs. Then we have Amari Cooper. He's finished as a wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game each of the past 2 seasons. Although he did finish as a wide receiver 10 in 2022, I think that he's the clear number 1 in this offense. Jerry Jeudy is the second best receiver. And David Njoku is a credible threat at tight end, but Amari Cooper is the definite number 1 receiver in this offense. I do think with Nick Chubb coming back from injury, Jerome Ford being fine but nothing special, and Dante Foreman being an okay power back, that they are going to have to pass whether they want to or not. And I think Amari Cooper is going to be the main beneficiary of this. Then Deebo Samuel has finished with the 3rd, 28th, and 12th most fantasy points per game, and he did finish as a wide receiver 15 this past season. He did miss a little bit of action this past season with injury. This guy does, however, have more upside, and when he gets hot in any given week, he could go off for 40 points. And like I said, in essentially what's going to be the same offense this season, they did add Ricky Pearsall. I don't think that Pearsall is going to receive, for instance, nearly as much of a target share as, say, Tank Dell is. And I think that the overall offensive efficiency is going to be a little bit better in San Francisco. So I personally would rather have Metcalf, Kupp, Neighbors, Ayuk, Cooper, and Deebo this season over Diggs and Collins. So in round 4, Rachaad White is going off the board as the RB14 as the first pick in this round, and then DJ Moore is going off the board as a wide receiver 22 in the second to last pick. So Rachaad White is being drafted as the RB14, and this past season he did have 15.8 fantasy points per game, which was 10th. This, however, was on the back of a crazy workload, especially considering that he was quite ineffective. Now, one thing, Dave Canales is no longer their head coach, so I do expect this offense to be quite a bit less efficient this season. But then they also drafted Bucky Irving. I do think that he's going to eat into some of these touches and reduce his overall workload. Now, while I still think he's going to be used in the red zone, another thing is Sean Tucker's looked really good during the preseason, so I think this is going to be a little bit more of a committee than it was this past season. And another thing, Rachaad White has a 29.0 BMI, below the 30.0 threshold to generally be used as a featured back. Although, to be fair, he was used as one this past season. But looking at a couple of stats here, his 272 carries were good for 2nd in the NFL, while his 70 targets were good for 9th. So he was top 10 in both carries and targets. I think that's the main thing that was leading to his large production this past season. When you look at his fantasy points per opportunity, his 0.78 were 34th, so he was not fantasy friendly on a per touch basis by any means. When we look at his yards created per touch, His 3.48 were good for 23rd. That's really not very good. His true yards per carry of 3.5 was 57th in the NFL. His 4.6 yards per touch were 33rd. And his 19.6% juke rate was good for 23rd. So overall, in my opinion at least, he's a fine receiving back who was just given a massive amount of opportunity that led to a little bit of an inflated finish compared to how talented he is. But I think he's going to be a very, very safe option in terms of his floor because he is one of the better receiving backs in the NFL. So a couple of players that I would rather have than Rachaad White at RB14 are Josh Jacobs. Remember that he's finished with the 13th and third most fantasy points per game in 2 of the past 3 seasons, including an RB1 finish in 2022. He's going to a Packers offense that is much better than anything he's ever had, and he's most likely going to be a featured back there who will get goal line work. Then you have Alvin Kamara. He's coming off an RB11 finish in which he scored the 3rd most fantasy points per game, much higher than Rachaad White, despite being suspended. Then you have Aaron Jones. He's finished with the 11th most fantasy points per game in 2 of the past 3 seasons. He's going to a Minnesota Vikings offense in which he is going to be the featured back. There is no one else there that is remotely as talented as Aaron Jones. And I do think that they're going to want to lean on him in both the passing game and the running game to help keep the pressure off of Sam Darnold. Then you have Kenneth Walker. I think he does have a lot more upside because he is a much better running back. And I think that the offense in Seattle under Ryan Grubb is going to be much, much, much more efficient, which is going to lead to a lot more rushing touchdowns for Kenneth Walker. So DJ Moore is going off the board as a wide receiver 22. I think he's going to be the wide receiver 24 this season, but still 2 spots of ADP is still 2 spots of ADP. I just think that there's a couple players that are going after him that I would just much rather have. So DJ Moore is coming off a wide receiver 6 season in which he had 16.9 fantasy points per game, which was 9th. And now, while he did receive a massive quarterback upgrade going from Justin Fields to Caleb Williams, he also saw the most increased target competition I've ever seen for somebody. They brought in Keenan Allen, who finished with the 3rd most fantasy points per game this past season, and drafted ex-wide receiver Rome Odunze at pick 9. So Rome's going to be the ex-wide receiver in 2 wide receiver sets. They're going to run a mixture of 11 and 12 personnel. So Keenan Allen's going to be in the slot. So the good news for DJ Moore is he's going to be the flanker in this offense generally. So even in 2 wide receiver sets, he is going to be in the game. I just think that the opportunity isn't going to be nearly what it was for him this past season. So I think he's much more talented than his finish is going to indicate this season. For instance, his 28.9% target share was good for 10th. That's going down. His 23.4% target rate was good for 30th, probably going down. His yards per out run of 2.34 was good for 16th, probably going down. Now, he actually wasn't very good at getting target separation. His 1.56 ranked 60th. He's just very, very good after the catch. Now, his route win rate of 45.2 was good for 64th. It's a lot lower than I thought it was going to be, and especially his win rate versus man. His 28.7% was good for 94th. I was shocked when I saw that. And then when we look at his dominator rating of 41%, that was good for 4th in the NFL. That's his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns, with Rome and Keenan coming in, as well as even Gerald Everett. So due to the increased target competition, I do think 2 wide receivers being drafted after him are going to finish well ahead of DJ Moore. So 2 wide receivers that I would rather have than DJ Moore at wide receiver 22 are Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. First of all, he's coming off a wide receiver 20 finish while averaging the 17th most fantasy points per game. The year before, he was the wide receiver 10 while also averaging the 17th most fantasy points per game. Nothing has really changed about his situation. He's the clear number 1 in that offense. His only serious competition is David Njoku. So I would much rather have him due to purely the volume that he's going to receive. And the same thing goes for Malik Neighbors. He is the only credible target in New York. It would not shock me if he received 170 targets. And now, while these are Daniel Jones targets, 170 targets is 170 targets. I think he is going to be a volume-driven, wide receiver 2 who is going to finish higher than DJ Moore. And in the future, if he's able to receive good or at least adequate quarterback play, is going to be in the top 10 annually. So those are players that I just don't like at their ADP and players I would rather have than those players who are going later in drafts. But what do you think? Do you agree with those players? Do you disagree? Who would you rather have than some of these players at their current ADP? Let me know in the comment section below. So if you're in Dynasty, check out these veterans that you can get for very, very cheap in trades to help push you over the top if you're a contender, as well as my tight end rankings for the season if you're in redraft. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.